In a life bound by duty, Megan Dawson marries a wealthy man in a coma to save her family's future. But what happens when love and sacrifice collide, forced into a life she never chose? Megan must fight against her glamorous sister, Tessa, who will stop at nothing to reclaim what she believes is hers. Will Megan's quiet strength be enough to hold on to the man she's come to love and the life she's building? This gripping tale of love, betrayal, and self-discovery will keep you hooked until the very end. Where are you watching from? Don't forget to subscribe to keep up with more exciting stories. Megan Dawson had always lived in the shadow of her older sister, Tessa. As a child, she had been the quiet, reserved one, the girl who excelled in academics, but never quite captured the attention of anyone the way Tessa did. Tessa, on the other hand, had been everything Megan wasn't. Stunning, outgoing, and effortlessly magnetic. She was the golden child, the one everyone adored. From their parents to their teachers to their friends, Tessa had always been the center of attention. Megan was content with staying in the background, happy to let her sister shine. But when it came to Tessa's engagement to William Cunningham, a successful and wealthy businessman, Megan could sense something had shifted. She had always been the backup, never the chosen one, but this time it felt like the stakes were higher than ever. Tessa's engagement to Will was the pinnacle of her success. Will was handsome, powerful, and charming, a perfect match for someone like Tessa. The world watched them, entranced by their glamorous life, and everyone expected them to be the ideal couple. Megan, always a distant spectator, stood on the sidelines, silently watching as Tessa lived the life she could only dream of. But, as perfect as things seemed on the surface, trouble was looming just beneath it. 2 months before the wedding, tragedy struck. Will, while driving his luxury car on a rainy night, was involved in a terrible accident. The car crashed on the slick, wet road, and Will was rushed to the hospital, where doctors quickly confirmed he was in a coma. Megan's heart sank when she heard the news. The family was devastated, but they were also desperate. The Cunningham family had promised to invest heavily in her father's business, a deal that would secure their future. But now, without Will's involvement, everything was hanging in the balance. Megan's parents, always concerned with appearances and their social standing, wasted no time in laying out a plan to secure the future of their family and their business. They weren't about to let the Cunningham fortune slip through their fingers just because of an unfortunate accident. That's when they made their decision. Megan's life, it seemed, was no longer hers to control. "Megan, listen to me," her mother had said, sitting across from her in the living room, her tone firm, as if she was giving orders rather than making a request. "The wedding still has to happen. Your sister cannot marry him in his condition. We need this deal, Megan. You need this deal, Megan. You need to step in." Megan had stared at her, her mind racing. "What are you asking me to do?" Her mother's gaze never wavered. "You will marry Will Cunningham. It's the only way to secure our future. The family cannot afford for the deal to fall apart. It's not about what you want, Megan. It's about what we need." The words hit Megan like a slap to the face. She couldn't breathe. Her chest tightened as she tried to find her voice. But he's in a coma. He's not even awake." Her father, who had been standing by the fireplace, turned to face her. His face was hard, a mask of cold pragmatism. "It doesn't matter. The contract needs to be honored. You'll marry him, Megan. Your sister doesn't have to go through with it. She can't after what happened. You will. We're counting on you. Do you, Will? We're counting on you. Do you understand?" Megan felt the weight of her father's words pressing down on her. There was no escape. Her sister, the one everyone had always favored, could walk away, but Megan couldn't. She was the one left behind, the one who had to clean up the mess. And what choice did she really have? Their family was in financial ruin. The Cunningham investment was their last lifeline. To say no would mean to abandon them all to their fate. To say yes would mean sacrificing her own happiness, her dignity, her future, and her very soul. "I don't have a choice, do I?" Megan whispered, the words tasting bitter as they left her lips. Her mother gave a sharp nod. "No, you don't." The next few days were a blur. Megan could barely process what was happening. She didn't know if it was the shock, the fear, or the utter disbelief that clouded her thoughts, but all she could focus on was the cold, calculated plan that was unfolding around her. Her parents, with their unyielding logic, arranged everything. The wedding would happen, even if it meant Will Cunningham would be a faceless figure lying in a hospital bed, his body hooked to machines that kept him tethered to life. Megan was going to marry a man she didn't know, a man who might never wake up. The wedding ceremony was planned to go ahead, no questions asked, and no one would ever know the truth. Except Megan, who would bear the weight of this burden on her shoulders for the rest of her life. On the day of the wedding, the atmosphere was chilling. The mansion was grand, its marble floors and high ceilings echoing with emptiness. The guests, well dressed and confused, took their seats, whispering in hushed tones. They knew Will was in a coma. They had heard the news. Yet they were still here, attending a wedding that had no groom, just a bride, standing alone at the altar. Megan stood there, her heart hammering in her chest as she clutched her bouquet. Her hands shook, but she held them tightly together, refusing to let anyone see the storm inside her. Across from her stood a nurse, ready to act as Will's representative. The officiant spoke, his words echoing in the cold room, asking Megan if she took Will Cunningham to be her lawfully wedded husband. The words barely left her lips. "I do." Her voice was steady, but inside, she felt the weight of the lie she had just spoken. There was no joy, no celebration, no kiss. Just a paper, a signature, and the knowledge that this marriage was never a choice. It was an obligation. The ceremony ended in silence. Megan could hear the faint hum of the chandeliers above her, the only sound in the vast empty room. She signed the marriage certificate, and as she did, she saw her new name, written in elegant, flowing script. It didn't feel real. It wasn't real. But it was her life now. When she walked into the Cunningham estate, it was as if she had stepped into a dream, one that didn't belong to her. The mansion was beautiful, filled with grandeur and luxury, but there was a coldness in the air, a chilling absence that hung over everything. Megan felt like an outsider, even though she now wore the title of Mrs. Cunningham. As the days passed, she dutifully cared for Will, sitting by his bedside, reading to him from the books on his shelves, adjusting his pillows, making sure the nurses were following the correct routines. But each moment felt like a prison. She was surrounded by opulence, by wealth, by power, yet none of it mattered. None of it felt real. In the mansion, people began to whisper about her. At first, it was subtle, a quiet murmur as she passed through the hallways. "She's just here for the money," they said. "She doesn't care about Will. She just wants to be part of this world." Megan ignored them. She didn't care about their judgments. She didn't care about the money. She was here for one reason: survival. But the whispers weren't all negative. Some of the staff started to notice how she took care of Will, how she tended to him with genuine care and devotion. Slowly, their attitude began to change. "Maybe she's not what we thought," one of the housekeepers remarked. "She actually seems to care for him." But the truth was, Megan had no idea what would happen next. She was trapped in a world she never asked for, forced to play a role she didn't choose. She had married a man who might never wake up, and her future was a question mark, hanging in the balance. As Megan sat by Will's bedside one night, her mind raced with all the questions she couldn't answer. What if he never woke up? What if he never woke up? What if her entire life was dictated by this forced marriage? What if, in the end, there was nothing left for her but the cold, empty walls of the Cunningham estate? And yet, despite it all, a small part of her held on to something. Something that she couldn't explain. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was the faintest whisper of love. And so, Megan sat there in the dark, beside a man who didn't know her, in a house that wasn't hers, praying for a future she wasn't sure would ever come. Megan Dawson had never expected her life to change so drastically. She had always lived in the shadow of her older sister, Tessa, who had everything: charm, beauty, and an easy way with people that drew others to her like a magnet. Megan, in contrast, was the quieter, less noticed one, a woman who preferred to stay in the background. While Tessa enjoyed all the attention and affection from their family, Megan was content with a life of solitude, lost in her books and dreams of a quiet existence, far from the pressure and spotlight. But everything changed when Tessa became engaged to William Cunningham, the heir to the Cunningham fortune, a man whose name was synonymous with power and wealth. The engagement had been the talk of the town. Everyone in their circle admired Tessa and Will's relationship, seeing it as the perfect union. Will was not just rich and successful, but charismatic, a man whose presence in a room could command attention and respect. Megan had watched from the sidelines, feeling both proud of her sister's accomplishments and painfully invisible. There was never any competition between them. Tessa had always been the star, but Megan had never felt a sense of bitterness, just a quiet resignation to the roles they had been given in their family. But then, tragedy struck. Will's car accident sent shockwaves through the family. The sleek black sports car he had been driving was crushed in the crash, and he was left in a cosh, and he was left in a coma, his life hanging by a thread. The entire Cunningham family was devastated, but no one more so than Megan's own parents, who were now faced with the harsh reality that the business deal they had been relying on was now in jeopardy. The Cunningham family had promised to back their business ventures, and their fortune was the key to keeping the Dawson family's legacy intact. Without Will, the deal would fall apart, and their family would be buried in financial ruin. It was in the wake of the accident that Megan's fate was sealed. Her mother had summoned her to the sitting room, the air thick with tension, as she and her father sat opposite Megan, their eyes cold and calculating. Her father's sharp gaze never wavered from her as he spoke, his voice firm and unwavering. "Megan," he began, his words cutting through the silence like a blade, "the wedding is still going to happen. Your sister can't marry Will in his current state. We need you to step in." Megan had recoiled in shock, her mind racing, trying to process what she had just heard. "What are you saying?" she stammered, her heart pounding in her chest. Her mother exhaled sharply, her tone hard as she continued. "You will marry Will Cunningham. It's the only way to secure our future. You've seen the numbers, Megan. Our business will collapse without this marriage. Your sister can't do it, but you can." Megan's world tilted on its axis. Her body went numb as she struggled to understand the magnitude of her situation. She had always known her parents were demanding, but this was beyond anything she could have ever anticipated. Her father's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing in a way that made her heart sink. "This isn't about love, Megan," he said, his voice cold, devoid of emotion. "It's about survival. This marriage isn't a choice. It's an obligation." The words stung. They cut deep, and for the first time in her life, Megan realized just how little control she had over her own future. Her family's survival had always been tied to wealth, to power, to business deals, but she had never imagined that she would be asked to sacrifice her own happiness for their benefit. And yet, here she was, being handed a role she never wanted. The role of a wife to a man who might never wake up, all to save the family's fortune. But, I don't even know him, Megan whispered, her voice barely audible. Her mother's cold eyes met hers, the sharpness of her gaze enough to silence any further protests. It doesn't matter. You'll marry him, Megan, and you'll do what's necessary to keep this family intact. Megan felt the walls closing in on her, suffocating her. There was no way out. There was no escape from the path her parents had laid before her. She was the forgotten daughter, always in Tessa's shadow, and now she was being asked to step into her sister's shoes, a role she hadn't earned, but was now being forced to accept. She had no choice but to comply. Her body felt numb as she walked through the halls of the Cunningham estate in the days that followed. The mansion was a far cry from the modest, familiar surroundings of her childhood home. Everything here was grand, polished, and perfect. An environment that seemed to mock her every step. As she prepared to marry a man who lay in a coma, she couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong. Her wedding day arrived with a sense of unreality. It was a grand affair, the mansion adorned with flowers and golden chandeliers. The guests were seated, their expressions a mix of confusion and disbelief. They had all heard of Will's accident, but here they were, watching a wedding that was nothing like a wedding at all. There was no groom at the altar, only a nurse who would act as Will's representative. Megan stood there, her hands trembling, her heart racing in her chest. She had never felt more out of place in her entire life. The officiant's voice echoed through the room, asking the same question he would ask any bride. Do you, Megan Dawson, take William Cunningham to be your lawfully wedded husband? Megan's lips parted, but the words didn't feel real. She was not marrying Will because she loved him. She was marrying him because she had no other choice. I do, she said, her voice thick with emotion. The words felt hollow as they left her lips. The ceremony proceeded with an air of emptiness. There was no kiss, no cheers, no celebration. Only silence punctuated by the faint sound of the pen scratching against the marriage certificate. The officiant pronounced them husband and wife, and Megan's heart sank. The weight of the ring on her finger felt like a symbol of her entrapment. She was now a married woman, but not in the way anyone would expect. She was married to a man who didn't know her, a man who might never wake up. And yet, as she signed her name, Megan felt something stir inside her. She didn't know if it was hope or resignation, but she was determined to make the best of the situation. After all, it was her life now. She had no choice but to accept it. Days passed, and Megan found herself in the grand mansion, living as Will's wife, but feeling more like a stranger in a foreign land. The mansion, though beautiful, felt cold and unwelcoming. The staff whispered behind her back, gossiping about her motives. They believed she was nothing more than an opportunist, marrying a man in a coma for his wealth. But they didn't know the truth. Megan didn't care about the money. She was here because she had no other choice. Each day was a new challenge. She cared for Will, sitting by his bedside, reading to him, adjusting his pillows, making sure the nurses were doing their job. She was alone in the mansion, isolated from the world outside, and she began to wonder if she would ever feel at home here. But there were small moments of change. The staff began to notice the way she cared for Will, how she tended to him with genuine care, even though he was unable to respond. It wasn't long before they started to whisper something different. She's not what we thought, one of the housekeepers remarked. She actually seems to care for him. Megan wasn't sure if she believed it herself, but she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't walk away. She couldn't walk away. She'd been given this role, this responsibility, and she would see it through, no matter the cost. As much as it hurt, as much as it felt like a betrayal of herself, she knew she had to stay. She had to do her duty, even if it meant giving up her own desires. And so, day by day, Megan continued her routine. She cared for Will. She stayed by his side. And as she did, a small part of her began to wonder, what if, just maybe, there could be something more? Megan had always lived in the background, the quiet one who was often overlooked in the grand spotlight of her family. Tessa, her older sister, had always been the shining star, effortlessly beautiful, confident, and always at the center of attention. Megan was the quieter one, the one who stayed in the shadows, perfectly content with her books and quiet life. It was a life that didn't require much from her, and yet it was a life she had learned to accept, even if it meant being invisible in her family's eyes. Her parents were always proud of Tessa, and Megan had learned to be okay with that, even though she sometimes longed for their approval, for their love. But nothing in her life had prepared her for the brutal reality that would soon come crashing down. The tragedy of Will Cunningham's accident shattered the seemingly perfect facade of the Dawson family's life. Will was the perfect man, wealthy, powerful, and destined to be Tessa's husband. They had been engaged for months, their wedding talked about by everyone, from the people in their circle to the press. It seemed like a fairy tale, a rich, successful businessman and a beautiful, powerful woman coming together in an almost picture. Perfect union. The world had been watching them, admiring them, enviring them, envying them. But then, one night, a terrible accident struck, and everything changed. Will's car crashed, leaving him in a coma with little hope of ever waking up. For Megan's parents, the accident wasn't just a tragedy. It was a disaster. The business deal with the Cunningham family, which promised to save their business, was now in jeopardy. Megan's father, the once proud patriarch of the Dawson family, was frantic, pacing back and forth in his study, while her mother sat in the living room, staring at the papers with an unreadable expression. Megan, who had been watching from the shadows, had no idea how serious things had become until she overheard her parents discussing their options. "Megan," her father's voice cut through the stillness of the night as he stood in front of her. "The wedding still needs to happen. We can't afford for the Cunningham family to back out. It's the only way to save everything we've worked for." Megan felt the blood drain from her face. "What do you mean?" "The wedding still needs to happen," she asked, her voice shaky. "Tessa is supposed to marry him, not me." Her father's face was hard, unyielding. "Your sister can't do it. She's too emotional. You're going to take her place. You will marry Will Cunningham." Megan recoiled. "What are you saying? How can I marry a man who's in a coma?" Her mother, who had been silent up until now, finally spoke, her voice calm but cold. "It's simple, Megan. Your sister isn't in a position to marry him. You are. You'll do what's necessary to ensure our family's future. Do you understand?" The weight of the words pressed down on Megan. There was no room for refusal, no place for her to voice her objections. Her parents had made their decision, and her life, it seemed, had already been mapped out for her. She had no choice but to comply. The Dawson family was in financial peril, and the Cunningham family's wealth was their last hope. They had always treated her as the lesser of the two daughters, and now they expected her of the two daughters, and now they expected her to be the one to make the sacrifice. Megan knew she couldn't defy them. She had seen the desperation in their eyes, the fear that their business empire would collapse without the deal with the Cunningham family. She had to do this, for them. But as she thought of the consequences, she couldn't shake the feeling that her life was slipping through her fingers. The days that followed were a blur of preparations and confusion. Megan had to step into Tessa's place, walking down an aisle that wasn't meant for her, in a marriage that wasn't hers to begin with. The wedding was set to take place even though Will was unconscious. his body tethered to machines that kept him alive but not truly living. The grand hall was filled with guests who, though polite, couldn't hide their confusion. The groom's seat remained empty, and yet the ceremony was still going forward. Megan stood at the altar, feeling like a stranger in a world that wasn't hers. Her hands trembled as she held her bouquet, her eyes fixed on the officiant, who asked her the same question any bride would hear on her wedding day. "Do you, Megan Dawson, take William Cunningham to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Megan's heart raced. She glanced at the row of guests, their faces a mixture of shock and disbelief. She couldn't do this. She couldn't do this. She couldn't marry a man who might never wake up. But she didn't have a choice. Her family's future depended on this. She swallowed her pride and her fear, and with a shaky voice, she said, "I do." The officiant nodded, his words moving like a dream. "I now pronounce you husband and wife." It was over. The ceremony ended with no kiss, no celebration, just the sound of a pen scratching across the marriage certificate. Megan felt numb as she signed her new name, Megan Cunningham. She wasn't sure what hurt more, the fact that she was now married to a man who didn't even know she existed, or the realization that her life had been reduced to a mere transaction, a formality meant to secure a future she never asked for. The days that followed were no easier. Megan moved into the Cunningham estate, a mansion that felt as cold and empty as her heart. The house was filled with wealth, power, and history, but it offered her no warmth, no comfort. Will's room was a sterile, quiet space, with only the beeping of machines to break the silence. She spent her days by his side, reading to him, adjusting his pillows, and doing whatever she could to make him comfortable. But as the days passed, it became clear that she wasn't just caring for a man in a coma. She was living a life that was no longer her own. Megan couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong here. The mansion, though beautiful, felt like a prison. The staff whispered behind her back, gossiping about her motives. They called her an opportunist, someone who had married Will for his money. But Megan didn't care about their whispers. She didn't care about the fortune. She was here because she had no other choice. And as much as it hurt, as much as she wanted to run away, she couldn't. Days turned into weeks, and Megan fell into a routine. She took care of Will as her parents had instructed, but something inside her was slowly starting to change. Despite the strange and uncomfortable circumstances, she began to feel a bond with the man she was married to, a bond that went beyond duty. It was as if her heart was reaching out to him, even though he couldn't respond. She wasn't sure if it was the loneliness that made her feel this way, or if, in the quiet of the mansion, a spark of affection was beginning to form. But the more she took care of him, the more she couldn't deny the growing feeling in her chest. And then, one day, everything changed. Megan was sitting by Will's bedside, reading aloud from one of the books on his shelf. It was something she had done every night, a simple act of routine. But as she read, something unexpected happened. Will's finger twitched. Megan froze, her heart leaping in her chest. Had she imagined it? She held her breath, waiting for something more. But nothing happened. That night, as she sat beside him again, her mind kept replaying the moment. The flicker of movement was small, almost imperceptible, but it had been there. She didn't want to get her hopes up. After all, Will had been in a coma for weeks, and no one knew when, or if, he would ever wake up. But the thought that something was changing, something that could mean his return, sent a surge of excitement through her. The next day, she noticed it again. Will's hand moved slightly. It was nothing significant, but it was enough to make her heart race. She called the doctor, her voice shaking with anticipation. The doctor, Dr. Whitmore, arrived quickly, and after conducting tests, he confirmed what Megan had feared. Will was waking up. His neurological activity was increasing. His body was responding to stimuli. It was a slow process, but it was happening. Megan couldn't believe it. She had spent so many days by his side, waiting for a sign that he was still there, still alive. And now that sign had come. She wasn't sure what it meant, or what would happen next, but one thing was clear: Will was fighting to come back. But as Will began to regain consciousness, the reality of their situation hit Megan harder than ever. She wasn't just caring for a man who had been in a coma. She was married to him, bound to him by a contract, a marriage that wasn't based on love or choice, but on duty and survival. She had sacrificed her own desires, her own future, to save her family, but now she had to face the consequences of that decision. Would Will ever remember her? Would he ever see her as more than just a woman who had been forced into his life? And when he woke up fully, would he want her by his side, or would he see her as a stranger who had no place in his world? For now, all Megan could do was wait. Wait for Will to wake up. Wait for the truth to unfold. And in the silence of the mansion, she couldn't help but wonder. Had she made the right choice? Megan Dawson couldn't help but wonder what she had gotten herself into. The days following her reluctant wedding had blended into one long, empty stream of events. The Cunningham mansion, with its towering marble columns, crystal chandeliers, and winding hallways, had become a place she no longer recognized. It was beautiful, undeniably so, but it felt more like a prison than a home. The air was thick with tension, an unsettling quiet that pressed against her, suffocating her every time she walked through the house. Megan had entered this world with no choice, married to a man who was in a coma, a man who was, for all intents and purposes, a stranger to her. It had been a strange and surreal transition from the life she had known to this gilded cage of wealth and expectation. And as she spent day after day caring for Will, she began to wonder just how much of it was real. Was she really part of this life, or was she simply playing a part? A pawn in a game she hadn't even been aware she was entering. At first, Megan had felt nothing for Will. How could she? She was married to a man she barely knew, a man who might never wake up. But as the days turned into weeks, something began to stir within her. She would sit by his side, her hand gently resting on his, reading to him, and for a brief moment, she could almost convince herself that this was real, that this was her life, that the man lying before her was the same man she had been married to on paper. Every now and then, she would catch herself imagining what he would be like when he woke up, what his voice would sound like, what his smile would look like, what it would feel like to hear him call her his wife in a way that wasn't forced, in a way that felt genuine. But those thoughts always faded as quickly as they came. She had no illusions. Will was still in a coma, and she was living a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. What Megan didn't know, however, was that her sister Tessa had already begun to set her own plans into motion. Tessa had never liked being overshadowed, never liked being second to anyone, especially not her own sister. When the accident had happened, when Will had been reduced to a shell of a man, Tessa had seen an opportunity, one she wasn't about to let slip away. She had always thought she would marry Will, and nothing, not even a tragic accident, was going to stand in her way. As Megan went about her daily routine, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. There were moments, fleeting but undeniable, when she would hear the staff whispering behind her back, gossiping about her. "She's only here for the money," they'd say. "She's using Will's condition to secure her place in this family." But Megan didn't care what they thought. She didn't care about the wealth or the status that came with being Mrs. Cunningham. She was here because her family had pushed her into it, because it was the only way to save them from ruin. That was the truth. Nothing else mattered. But as time went on, the whispers in the mansion grew louder. The staff began to notice something else, something they hadn't expected. Megan wasn't just playing the role of a wife. She was genuinely caring for Will, something that surprised them all. She was the one who sat by his side every day, the one who read to him, talked to him, adjusted his pillows when they were uncomfortable. She was there, day in and day out, doing everything in her power to make sure he was comfortable. It was clear she wasn't just waiting for him to die as everyone had assumed. Megan truly seemed to care for the man lying in that bed. Megan had no idea that, in her quiet, unassuming way, she had begun to win over not just the staff, but the entire mansion. There were whispers of admiration now, about how she was handling things with grace, how she was taking care of Will with a love that was starting to become undeniable. But even as the staff's opinion of her began to change, Megan still couldn't escape the feeling that there was something more at play, something bigger than her role as a caretaker. And then, one day, something happened. Something that would change everything. Megan was sitting by Will's side, reading aloud from one of his favorite books. When she noticed it, his finger twitched. Just once. It was a slight movement, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to send Megan's heart racing. Had she imagined it? She looked at him closely, holding her breath as she watched for any further signs of movement. And then, a few moments later, it happened again. His hand shifted ever so slightly, as if responding to her presence. Megan's breath caught in her throat. Could it be? Was Will starting to wake up? She didn't dare to hope. After all, the doctors had been saying for weeks that they weren't sure if Will would ever regain consciousness. But there it was, the faintest glimmer of something real, something that said he might just come back to her. She didn't know how to explain it, but there was a connection she could feel in the air, a pull between them that she couldn't ignore. Megan called the doctor, Dr. Whitmore, and within an hour, he arrived at the mansion, his expression unreadable as he examined Will's condition. Megan stood anxiously by his side, watching as he checked the machines, looking for any signs of neurological activity. After what felt like an eternity, Dr. Whitmore turned to her, his face a mix of surprise and cautious optimism. "You were right," he said. "His brain activity is increasing. His body is responding to stimuli. It's slow, but it's happening." Megan's heart leaped in her chest. She couldn't believe it. She had been so used to the silence, to the stillness of Will's body, that the idea of him waking up felt like a dream. But now it was real. Will was coming back. The next few days were filled with nervous anticipation. Megan stayed by Will's side, never leaving him for too long. She spoke to him, telling him about the world outside, about the things that had happened while he had been unconscious. She didn't know if he could hear her, but she couldn't stop herself from talking. She needed him to know that someone was here, that someone cared, even if it wasn't the person he had expected. And then, finally, after what felt like an eternity, Will's eyelids fluttered. His eyes, once closed in a deep, lifeless sleep, began to open. Megan gasped, her heart pounding in her chest. Her heart pounding in her chest. He was awake. He was really awake. But there was one problem. Will didn't recognize her. "Megan?" he asked, his voice weak and confused as he scanned the room with wide, uncertain eyes. Megan's heart sank as she realized the painful truth. Will didn't remember her. He didn't remember their marriage. He didn't remember the woman who had been by his side every day, caring for him, waiting for him to wake up. His confusion was evident in his eyes, and it tore at her. I don't remember you," Will said, his voice shaky as he looked at her.
Who are you?
Megan felt the weight of his words crash down on her. All the work, all the effort she had put into caring for him, all the feelings she had started to develop for him, none of it mattered. To Will, she was just a stranger, someone who had somehow ended up by his side. The love she had hoped for, the connection she had been building, was nothing more than a distant dream. She stood there frozen, unsure of what to do. She had been prepared for a lot. She had prepared herself for the pain of being married to a man who didn't love her, to a man who didn't love her, to a man who might never wake up. This was something else entirely. This was a reality she wasn't ready for. This was the man she had married, but he didn't remember her. He didn't even recognize her. The truth hit her hard. All those days, all that care, it didn't matter. Will didn't remember her, and she was left to wonder what her place was in this world now. Was she just a caretaker? Was she always going to be the invisible woman in the background of his life? The one who had never been chosen, the one who had never truly mattered? But as she stood there, her heart heavy with uncertainty, something inside her shifted. Meng realized that she couldn't give up. Not now. She had cared for Will when no one else had, and she wasn't going to stop now. If there was even a chance that Will could come back to her, she was going to take it. She wasn't going to let this story end in defeat. She was going to fight for him, fight for their future, and fight for their future, and fight for the love she knew had always been there, even if Will didn't remember it yet. And so, she stayed by his side, her heart pounding with hope and fear, waiting for him to remember. Waiting for him to remember, waiting for him to see her. For the first time. Megan sat in the quiet of the Cunningham estate, her thoughts swirling like the autumn leaves that danced across the expansive grounds outside. It had been weeks since Will had awakened from his coma, and while the doctors had assured her that his recovery was moving forward, the emotional distance between them seemed to grow with every passing day. The man she had married, this stranger who lay before her, fragile and confused, was still a mystery. He didn't remember her, and the life they had started together felt like it belonged to someone else. But Megan couldn't shake the sense of purpose that had kept her tethered to this life, to this man. She had promised him, in the darkest of times, that she would stay, and stay she did, though it came with the deep ache of unanswered questions and the quiet agony of longing for something that might never come. Will, despite his progress, remained elusive. His memory was fragmented, pieces of his past locked away behind a veil of amnesia that seemed impossible to pierce. When he looked at Megan, his gaze was clouded with confusion. Not recognition, not recognition. He saw a woman at his bedside, someone who cared for him, but she was a stranger to him. There were moments when his eyes would linger on her, as if searching for something familiar, something that would give him the key to unlocking their shared past. But there was nothing, only emptiness. His eyes would flicker, like a light bulb that was about to go out, before they would turn away, as if afraid of the truth he couldn't grasp. The days slipped by in a haze of routine. Megan would sit by his side, reading aloud, talking to him about things he could no longer remember. She told him about their brief marriage, the awkwardness of it all, how she had been forced into this role, how she had grown to care for him in ways she didn't expect. She spoke of Tessa, of the family dynamics, of everything she could think of, hoping that something, anything, would trigger a memory, a spark of recognition. But it was futile. Will's eyes would remain distant, his mind adrift in a sea of forgetfulness. The connection they once shared felt as though it had never existed, and it left Megan questioning everything she thought she knew about herself, about her place in the world. But even as the days grew darker and more uncertain, something in her refused to let go. She couldn't leave him. Not now. Not when he was so close, so vulnerable. It had become more than duty. It had become something deeper, a sense of responsibility she couldn't escape. She had promised him, in his coma, that she would be there. And now that he was awake, the promise was all she had left. Megan had never been one to give up on something, or someone, so easily, and though it seemed like Will's heart belonged to another life, to a past that wasn't hers, she couldn't bring herself to walk away. One night, as the mansion stood in eerie silence, Megan stood by Will's bedside, watching him as he slept. His face, once full of life and vitality, was now marred by confusion, by the ghost of a man he had been before. He shifted slightly in his sleep, his brow furrowing as if caught in a nightmare. Megan's heart ached for him. She longed for the moment when he would wake up and smile at her, when he would wake up and smile at her, when he would recognize her as the woman who had stood by him, who had fought for him. But that moment never came. Instead, there was only silence, a silence that pressed down on her like a heavy weight, making it hard to breathe. Tessa's return to the mansion had been inevitable. Megan had known, deep down, that it was only a matter of time before her sister would come back, drawn by the idea of reclaiming what she thought was rightfully hers. After all, Tessa had been the one who had been engaged to Will before the accident, the one who had been the perfect fiancé, the one who had been destined to marry him. But now she was back, and it was as if the earth had shifted beneath Megan's feet. She had never felt truly seen by her family, never truly understood. But now, with Tessa back in the picture, it was as if she had faded into the background once again. Megan was acutely aware of the change in the air the moment Tessa walked back into the mansion. There was no longer any pretense of kindness, no masked politeness. Tessa's eyes were cold, calculating, and as soon as she arrived, it was clear she had one goal in mind: to reclaim Will. She was ruthless in her pursuit, pretending to care for him, pretending to support his recovery. But underneath it all, Megan could feel the sharp edge of competition, the silent war between them. Every time Tessa entered Will's room, Megan could feel her presence like a shadow falling over her. Tessa would sit by his side, smoothing her fingers over his hand, whispering sweet nothings, pretending to be the loving fiancé. And Will, poor Will, still couldn't remember who she was. He would look at Tessa with confusion, as if she were a ghost from his past, someone he could never fully grasp, someone who only existed in his fragmented memories. But Megan, too, was a stranger to him. She had promised to stay, but she had never promised to be someone he would ever recognize. It was in these moments, when Tessa would lean over him with her polished smile and false concern, that Megan's heart would break. How could she compete with the past? How could she compete with the life that Will once had? She had been thrust into this role, forced to marry him when he was unable to speak, unable to choose. And yet, as Tessa's shadow loomed larger, Megan began to wonder if this was a battle she could ever win. Days passed, and Megan continued her silent vigil, watching Will with a mixture of longing and frustration. She was always there, but she was never the one he turned to. His attention was focused on Tessa, whose every word seemed to reach him, whose every touch seemed to reach him, whose every touch seemed to soothe him. Megan's presence was nothing more than a background hum, a reminder of the life he couldn't remember, of the woman who had been forced into his world. But then, one evening after Tessa had left, something changed. Will stirred, his eyes opening slowly. Megan's heart skipped a beat, her breath catching in her throat as she leaned forward, unsure if this was another fleeting moment, or if it was something more. Will's eyes, usually so distant and unfocused, slowly focused on her. There was no confusion in his gaze this time. He looked at her with an intensity that made her heart race. "Why haven't you left?" His voice was hoarse, thick with sleep and confusion, but the question cut through the silence like a blade. "You should have left after all this time. Why are you still here?" Megan's throat tightened, and she struggled to keep her voice steady. "Because I promised you," she said softly, her hand trembling as it hovered over his. "I promised I would stay, and I'm not leaving. Not now, not ever." Will blinked, confusion still clouding his features. But something shifted in his expression. For the first time in weeks, Megan saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes. He didn't remember their past, not the wedding or the promises made, but there was something in the way he looked at her. A quiet understanding that perhaps she was more than just a caretaker, more than just the woman who had married him out of obligation. "You promised," Will repeated, his voice faint as if he was trying to piece the puzzle together. Megan nodded, the lump in her throat making it hard to speak. "Yes, I promised I would stay by your side, even if you couldn't remember me, even if I had to fight for you." Will's hand twitched slightly under hers, as if he was trying to respond, but couldn't find the words. And in that moment, Megan realized something profound. It didn't matter that Will couldn't remember their past, that he couldn't remember their past, that he couldn't recognize her as his wife. What mattered was that she had kept her promise. What mattered was that she was still here, still fighting for him, still willing to stand by his side no matter how uncertain the future was. And perhaps, just perhaps, that was enough. Megan had never imagined that her life would spiral into something so unrecognizable. Her existence, once filled with the quiet comfort of solitude and routine, had been uprooted by forces far beyond her control. The sudden responsibility of marrying Will Cunningham, the wealthy and successful businessman who had once been engaged to her sister, Tessa, was a fate that had been thrust upon her with no warning. There had been no love in their marriage, no desire, just duty. Duty to her family, duty to her parents' crumbling business, and duty to a man who could neither speak nor remember his own name. But now, as the days turned into weeks, Megan had grown accustomed to the strange life she had been forced into. The mansion, with its cold marble floors and high, echoing ceilings, had become a place where she both longed for escape and somehow couldn't bear to leave. Will, lying in the bed she had kept vigil by, had remained unconscious for so long, and though he had slowly begun to stir, his mind remained an empty void, a dark abyss that threatened to swallow any traces of their shared past. Megan had read to him, talked to him, told him of the world he had once known, but nothing seemed to break through. He wasn't her husband yet, not in the way that truly mattered, not in the way that truly mattered, not in the way that would make this forced union into something real. Still, Megan had no choice but to continue. After all, she had promised him. Hadn't she? Tessa's reappearance had been inevitable. Megan knew her sister too well to believe she would stay away for long. Not when the opportunity to reclaim her life, the life she thought she had lost, the life she thought she had lost, was at hand. After all, Tessa had once been Will's fiancé, the woman who had been promised everything, the wealth, the prestige, and the perfect future with him. But Will's coma had stolen that future from her, and now, with Will's faintest signs of recovery, Tessa was back like a hawk circling its prey. Megan had never felt the sharp sting of competition quite like this. She had lived her whole life in Tessa's shadow, always the second choice, always overlooked. And now, even in the face of the terrible circumstances she had found herself in, she was still nothing more than a placeholder, a pawn in a game that her sister played far too well. Tessa moved through the mansion like she owned it, slipping into Will's room with practiced ease, smiling at him in that way that Megan knew so well. The perfect, loving fiancé, the woman who had once claimed Will's heart. But Megan wasn't fooled. Tessa wasn't here to care for him. She was here to reclaim him, to take back what she thought was hers by right. And every time she entered Will's room, Megan could feel the tension coil tighter in her chest, the weight of her own insignificance pressing down on her. It wasn't just the physical presence of Tessa that bothered Megan. It was the way everyone else in the house treated her. The way her parents, the staff, and even the doctors seemed to cater to Tessa's every whim, as if she was the one who had always been the center of Will's world. Megan's role had been reduced to a shadow of what it could have been, a mere afterthought. She had been married to Will out of obligation, yes, but in their eyes she was nothing more than a temporary fix, a substitute for Tessa, until Will could recover enough to make his own decisions. It was as if Megan herself was not even part of the equation anymore. She had become invisible. an unremarkable figure moving through the mansion, tending to Will's needs, but receiving nothing in return. But Megan wasn't one to give up easily. She had spent too many years being pushed aside to let her sister take the life she had been forced into without a fight. There were nights when Megan would lie awake, staring at the ceiling of her cold bedroom, the distant sounds of Tessa's laughter drifting through the walls, like a reminder of everything Megan could never have. But Megan knew she couldn't afford to dwell on the past, not when Will's recovery was still uncertain, not when their lives hung in the balance of fragile promises and unspoken truths. She had made a vow to stay by his side no matter what, and she would see that vow through. As the days passed, something in Megan began to shift. She had always been the quiet one, the one who kept her thoughts to herself and lived in the background. But being here, in this mansion, surrounded by people who expected her to stay in the shadows, began to stoke a fire within her that she hadn't known existed. The more Tessa made her presence felt, the more Megan felt herself becoming stronger, more determined to take control of her own fate. She wasn't going to let her sister push her aside again. This time, she would fight for what she deserved. But fighting wasn't going to be easy. Tessa, with all her charm and beauty, was a formidable opponent. She had always known how to get what she wanted, and Megan wasn't sure if she had the strength to stand up to her. Tessa had already begun to weave her web of lies, telling Will stories of their perfect past together, trying to erase Megan from his memory completely. Megan had seen it in the way Tessa spoke to him, her voice sweet and seductive, as if she was trying to remind Will of the life he had lost, the love he had left behind. And all the while, Will, still confused and disoriented, had no idea what was happening. No idea that the woman sitting at his bedside wasn't the woman who had fought for him, who had stayed by his side through all of it. One afternoon, after Tessa had left the room, Megan found herself standing beside Will's bed, watching him sleep. The weight of her sister's presence had become almost unbearable, but it was nothing compared to the weight in Megan's chest. Will was still here, still with her, still alive. But how much longer could she keep pretending? How much longer could she live in this house, in this life, knowing that her sister was doing everything she could to take everything back? But Megan wasn't about to let that happen. She had already given so much of herself to this marriage, so much of herself to this man, that she wasn't about to let someone like Tessa take it away from her. She had fought for this family, for the future of her own, and though it had been a life she had never chosen, it was the one she would have to fight for. Tessa may have been the woman Will had once loved, but Megan was the woman who had been there when it mattered. Megan was the one who had stood by him, who had kept the darkness at bay. And no matter how much her sister tried to claim her place in his life again, Megan knew that the bond they shared, the connection they had formed, would not be so easily erased. It wasn't until one evening, as she sat by Will's side reading to him from one of his favorite books, that Megan finally understood what needed to be done. Will's eyes fluttered open, his gaze slightly unfocused, but he turned to her, his hand reaching out to hers. His touch was tentative, unsure, as if testing the waters, as if he was trying to remember something. And in that moment, Megan knew what she had to do. She had to fight. She had to fight. She had to fight for herself, for Will, and for the life they could have together, no matter how uncertain it was. "I'm not leaving," she whispered softly, her voice filled with conviction. "I'm not leaving you, Will. I'm here, and I will always be here." Will's eyes softened, and though he couldn't remember the past, Megan could see it. The faintest spark of recognition, a flicker of understanding that maybe, just maybe, he was starting to see her, really see her, for the first time. And in that moment, Megan knew that no matter what came next, no matter how hard Tessa tried to reclaim what she thought was hers, she would never back down. She had come too far to let it all slip away. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, Megan felt as though she was ready to win. Megan sat in the grand, empty hall of the Cunningham estate, her eyes staring out at the perfectly manicured gardens, her mind adrift in a sea of uncertainty. The silence that enveloped the mansion had become deafening. After weeks of caring for Will, of being by his side as he recovered from his coma, Megan had come to realize something she hadn't fully understood before. She was fighting a battle that was bigger than just a marriage, bigger than just a marriage, bigger than even her love for Will. She was fighting for a future that wasn't guaranteed, for a life that felt more and more like a fleeting dream. For months, she had stayed true to her word, true to the promise she had made to Will when he had been unable to defend himself, unable to make his own decisions. She'd kept the house running, cared for him when no one else had, tried to create a semblance of normalcy in a world that felt like it had come undone. But even as the days had passed, she could feel something stirring within her. A growing sense of realization that the life she had been forced into was slipping further away from her grasp. No matter how hard she tried, no matter how much she cared for Will, she was still not truly part of this world. She was still the outsider, the afterthought, the woman who had been married out of necessity, not love. Tessa's return to the estate had been the catalyst for everything. She had walked back into their lives as though nothing had changed, as if she still had every right to claim Will as her own. Megan had known deep down that her sister's return was inevitable. She had always known Tessa, with her charm and beauty, would come back to stake her claim on Will's life, on the future she had lost in the wake of his accident. And now that Will was starting to wake up, starting to show signs of recovery, Tessa was more determined than ever to get back what she thought was hers. Megan watched from the sidelines as Tessa weaved her lies, telling Will stories of their life together, of the wedding they were supposed to have, of the future they were meant to share. It was also painfully clear. Tessa was trying to rewrite the past, to make herself the hero in this story. And Megan, who had fought for Will's survival, was nothing more than an unwelcome presence in the background, a woman whose role was now reduced to a shadow. Every time Tessa entered Will's room, Megan could feel the tension in the air. It was a quiet, subtle shift, a change in the way Will looked at her, a change in the way Will looked at her, a change in the way the staff looked at her, as though they were all expecting her to step aside and let Tessa take her place. Megan had spent so much time fighting for a life she never chose that she had almost forgotten what it was like to feel truly seen, to feel like she was someone worth fighting for. And yet, here she was, fighting for the man she had been married to, out of duty, fighting for a future that might never be hers. But as the days wore on, Megan's resolve began to solidify. She was no longer just the woman who had been thrust into this marriage because her family had demanded it. She was no longer going to be the passive bystander in her own life. She had fought for Will when he couldn't fight for himself. She had stayed by his side, given up her own hopes and dreams, simply because her family had expected it of her. But now she realized it wasn't enough to simply fulfill her duty. She had to fight for herself. She had to take control of her own future, even if it meant confronting Tessa, even if it meant standing up to everyone who had ever overlooked her, who had never truly seen her. One night, as she sat by Will's bedside, the weight of her thoughts pressing down on her, she heard him stir. For the first time, in what felt like forever, he was awake, really awake. His eyes, once unfocused and lost, now seemed to have found her, as though he was finally looking at her, really looking at her. And it was then that Megan realized just how much she had been holding on to the hope that Will would wake up, that he would remember her, that he would remember her, that he would see her for the woman she had become, not just the woman she had been forced to be. Megan? Will's voice was low, still thick with confusion, but there was something in the way he said her name, something that made her heart skip a beat. You've been here all this time? Megan nodded, her voice catching in her throat. Yes, I've been here. I promised you I wouldn't leave. Will's gaze softened, his eyes scanning her face as though trying to piece together the fragments of their life. "Why? Why? Why didn't you leave like everyone else?" The question hit her like a punch to the gut. Why hadn't she left? It would have been so easy to walk away, to let Tessa take her place, to give up on everything she had fought for. But there was something inside her that refused to let go, something inside her that knew deep down that Will was worth it, that their future, no matter how uncertain, was worth fighting for. She had stayed because she had made a promise, and she would keep it, even if it meant sacrificing everything she had known. "I stayed because I made a promise to you," she said, her voice steady, despite the lump in her throat. "And because I care about you, Will. I always have." For the first time since his awakening, Will looked at her, not with confusion, but with something deeper, something that resembled understanding. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was the beginning of something. He was starting to see her, to truly see her, for who she was. She wasn't just a woman who had married him out of obligation. She was the woman who had been there when no one else had. She was the woman who had fought for his recovery, who had spent countless hours by his side, reading to him, caring for him, hoping for the day when he would finally wake up and remember. But even as Megan felt the stirrings of hope, she knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Tessa was still there, still lurking in the background, waiting for her chance to reclaim what she thought was hers. And the more Megan tried to build a life with Will, the more Tessa's presence became an insurmountable obstacle. Tessa had always been the one who had everything, the looks, the charm, the confidence. And now she was determined to get Will back, no matter what it took. She wasn't going to let Megan take away the one thing she had always wanted. Megan, however, was no longer the woman who had been pushed aside, no longer the woman who had quietly accepted her place in the world. She had fought for her family. She had fought for her family. She had fought for Will. And now she was ready to fight for herself. She had spent too long living in the shadows, too long waiting for someone else to see her worth. But she was done waiting. It was time for her to take control of her own life, to stand up for what she deserved, even if it meant facing Tessa head on. The confrontation between the sisters was inevitable. Megan had known, deep down, that it would come to this. Tessa had always been used to getting what she wanted, and now she was determined to reclaim Will, to erase Megan from his life, but Megan wasn't going to back down. She wasn't going to let Tessa rewrite their story, to make herself the hero in a tale that didn't belong to her. This was Megan's fight now, and she wasn't going to lose. When Tessa walked into Will's room one evening, her eyes full of determination, Megan knew that this was it. It was time to put an end to this, to finally take control of her own future. "You need to step aside, Megan," Tessa said, her voice dripping with folk sweetness. "You've played your part. Now it's time for me to take over." Megan stood up, her spine straightening, her jaw clenched with determination. "No, Tessa. This time, I'm not stepping aside. I'm here to stay." Tessa's eyes flashed with anger, but Megan didn't flinch. She had come too far to be intimidated, too far to back down. This was her life, her future, and she was finally taking control. "I'm not going anywhere," Megan said, her voice firm and resolute. "And neither is Will. If anyone's going to rewrite this story, it's going to be me." And, with that, the battle lines were drawn. Tessa, for all her charm and beauty, could no longer push Megan into the shadows. The fight was on, and Megan was ready to face it, no matter the cost. She was no longer the forgotten daughter, no longer the woman who had been forced into a life she never chose. She was the woman who had fought for love, for family. And now, she was fighting for herself, and she would win. Megan's heart beat, with a mix of anxiety and resolve, as she stood in the Cunningham Estate's grand foyer, her eyes fixed on the wide, polished staircase ahead. The house was quiet, far quieter than it had been in the days when Will had still been unconscious, when the soft hum of the estate had been nothing more than a distant background to her solitary, repetitive routine. But now, after Will's gradual recovery, everything felt charged, alive with a strange tension that Megan could no longer ignore. She had fought for him, fought to keep the life that had been forced upon her intact. But now it seemed like the stakes were higher than ever. Tessa's return to the mansion had stirred up old feelings, resentment, jealousy, uncertainty, and Megan couldn't shake the nagging sense that she was losing ground, losing Will, to a life she had never been a part of. Megan had always known that Tessa was relentless, but now, seeing her sister so assured, so certain that everything was returning to the way it was before the accident, felt like a punch to the gut. Will, still struggling with his memory, hadn't yet remembered everything. He hadn't remembered the painful circumstances of his marriage to Megan or the part he had played in her heart. But Megan had come to care for him in a way she never expected. She couldn't deny the emotional connection that had grown between them over the past months. What had started as an obligation, fueled by family pressure, had blossomed into something deeper. Yet, here was Tessa, coming back into the fold like nothing had changed, as if she had every right to claim Will as hers again. It was maddening, and as Megan walked through the halls of the mansion, she could feel the walls closing in on her. Every room, every corner of this house reminded her that she was only here because she had been coerced, that she wasn't truly seen for who she was, but merely as a placeholder, a replacement for the life that Tessa was supposed to have. It was as though she had never been part of Will's world, only a temporary figure who had been set aside for when Tessa returned to claim what was hers. But it was this house, this mansion, that had also become her battleground. She had fought for Will's well-being when everyone else had written him off, when they had written her off. She had shown him kindness, patience, love, everything that his family had failed to do while he was unconscious. And now she was going to fight for herself, for her place here. She wasn't just going to fade into the background again. Tessa's first real attempt to reassert control came one evening, just as Megan had finished reading to Will in his room. The air in the mansion seemed to thicken, the tension between the two sisters palpable. Tessa glided into the room as though she had never left, her presence immediate and commanding. Will, still recovering and confused by his fragmented memories, turned toward Tessa with the kind of unreadable gaze that Megan had come to dread. He didn't remember Tessa in the way she hoped. It was clear that his memory was still clouded, and Megan couldn't help but feel a small pang of hope at that. But it wasn't hope for long. Tessa leaned over Will's bed, her voice smooth and sweet as she played the role of the loving fiancé who had waited patiently for his return. "I've missed you, Will," she murmured, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of his hand, pretending to care for him in a way that felt so false to Megan. Her sister's every word, every touch was calculated, a reminder of the woman she once had been and still tried to be. Will's eyes, still blank with confusion, followed Tessa's every move, and Megan could see the glint of uncertainty in his eyes, a flicker of recognition that, for a moment, seemed to be directed at her. He turned to her as if seeking something, as though he was asking for answers to the questions he couldn't articulate. Megan's chest tightened as she looked at Will, wondering if this was the moment when everything would finally break apart. She had given everything to him, had stayed by his side when she could have walked away, but now Tessa was here, making her claim. "I'm your wife," Megan said softly, trying to steady her shaking hands as she spoke. "I've been here for you, Will. Through everything." Will looked at her, his confusion deepening as he tried to process her words. His face softened, but it wasn't recognition that she saw in his eyes. It was uncertainty, a hesitation that made her feel like a stranger. And that was the truth of it, wasn't it? To Will, she was still a stranger. Their marriage, their shared life, felt like a distant memory, something erased by his accident and his incomplete recovery. Tessa, with her polished beauty and poised demeanor, had always been the woman he had imagined his future with. And now, Megan was fighting for a future that felt like it would never be hers. She had no illusions about Will's feelings. He didn't remember her as his wife. He didn't remember the promise they had made, and he didn't know the sacrifices she had made for him. But what Megan couldn't ignore anymore was the fact that this wasn't just about Will. It was about her. She had spent so long living in Tessa's shadow, following orders, playing the dutiful daughter, the forgotten sister. Now she was fighting for something real, something that wasn't dependent on Will's memories. She was fighting for herself, for the woman she had become in the years of silence, for the woman who had been forced to sacrifice everything for a life she never chose. She wasn't going to let Tessa take that from her, not again. Tessa's voice broke through her thoughts, a low, almost purring tone. "Megan, darling," she said, turning to face her sister with a sweet smile that Megan knew all too well. "Don't you think it's time you let me handle this? You've done your part, but I'm the one he needs right now. I'm the one who knows him. I'm the one he's always wanted." Megan's jaw tightened. Every word Tessa spoke was a lie, and Megan knew it. Tessa hadn't been there for Will during the long months of his coma. Tessa hadn't stayed by his side when no one else cared. She hadn't fought for him. It had been Megan who had stayed, Megan who had learned to love a man who couldn't even remember her name. And now Tessa was trying to steal it all back, trying to erase the bond that Megan had fought so hard to build. "I'm not stepping aside," Megan said, her voice firm despite the fear that bubbled in her chest. "I'm not going anywhere. I promised Will I would stay by his side, and I meant it. I'm not giving up on him." Tessa's face twisted in a flash of anger, but it was quickly masked by her usual veneer of control. "You really think you can keep him, Megan? You're just a placeholder, a fill-in. Will won't ever remember what we had. And when he does wake up, when he realizes he's married to you, what then? What will you do when he doesn't want you, and he doesn't want you anymore?" The words stung, cutting through the air with a venom Megan had never expected to hear from her sister. It was true, wasn't it? She had no real place in Will's life. He hadn't chosen her, but Megan's eyes hardened as she stared at Tessa, no longer the uncertain, timid woman she had once been. "I'll stand by him," she said quietly, "because that's what love is, and I'm not going to let you tear us apart." Tessa scoffed, stepping back, as though Megan had said something beneath her. "We'll see about that, won't we?" she muttered under her breath, turning on her heel to walk away. But Megan's resolve only strengthened as the door clicked shut behind Tessa. This wasn't over. It couldn't be. Megan wasn't going to let her sister, or anyone, take away the life she had fought for, the love she had slowly built with Will, even if it was still in its fragile stage. She had come too far to back down now. As she stood there, Will's gaze resting on her, still lost in his own confusion, Megan made a vow to herself. She wasn't just fighting for Will's memory. She was fighting for a future that was her own. For the first time in her life, she wasn't going to let someone else decide her fate. She had been forced into this world, but now she was going to take control, and she wasn't going to let anyone, none, even Tessa, stop her from having the life she deserved. Megan knew that the road ahead would be full of challenges, full of heartache and obstacles, but she was ready to face it all. She had spent too long being forgotten, too long being the one pushed aside, but no more. She was ready to fight for her place in this story, and this time she would win. The story of Megan, Will, and Tessa is a powerful reminder of the strength that lies within us, even when we feel trapped by circumstances. Megan's journey teaches us that true love isn't just about the easy moments or the idealized version of a relationship. It's about commitment, sacrifice, and standing by someone even when it seems like there's no way forward. Megan could have walked away at any moment, could have let her sister reclaim everything that was rightfully hers, but instead she chose to fight for herself, for the life she had come to build, and for the man she had come to love. The story also highlights the importance of self-worth. Megan had spent her life being overlooked, pushed aside in favor of her sister's more glamorous presence, but she realized that her value wasn't determined by the approval of others. She discovered that she had the power to shape her own future, to choose her own path, and to fight for what was hers. In the end, it wasn't about Will's memory or the approval of her family. It was about Megan finding her own voice and taking ownership of her life. Megan's story is a lesson in resilience, love, and the courage to step out of the shadows and into the light. It reminds us that even when faced with overwhelming challenges, we can always find the strength to fight for what truly matters. So, never let anyone define your worth, and always remember, the fight for yourself is worth every sacrifice. Where are you watching from? And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories that inspire and empower. We'd love to have you join us on this journey.